So for probably about 7 years now, I've been in this inquiry, Matthew, of how do we change where money flows throughout society? And if we do that, can we change power? Can we change our relationship to the earth and how we interact with the earth through the economy?
Welcome to the Regeneration Will Be Funded. My name is Matthew Monahan, and in this series, we're exploring the intersections of regenerative finance, technology, and our living planet. Created with Ma Earth, you can find all of our conversations and more at maearth.com. Thanks for joining us. Today's guest is Samantha Power from Finance for Gaia. Samantha is an ecological economist who spent over 5 years working at the World Bank. So Samantha has a really unique perspective into global climate finance, and she's now entered a new stage of her work. In this discussion, I ask her how important really are global agreements like the Paris Agreement. We talk about financial logic to drive collective change. We go into recentering local value and new innovations around things like bioregional funds. We riff on the potential intersections of Web3, talk about new forms of data reporting and metrics, and other converging technologies, and more. I really enjoyed this conversation with Samantha. It was recorded at Bioneers in April 2023. I hope you enjoy it. Samantha Power. We are here today with Samantha Power. Samantha is an ecological economist, nature finance specialist. She is the founder of Finance for Gaia. Thank you, Samantha, for being with us.
Yeah, excited to be here and to talk with you, Matthew.
And we're here at Bioneers. We just met a couple days ago. I'm curious how your experience has been at the conference.
Super rich, really full. So many wonderful connections, people that I have been working with for years now, flying in from all over the world, particularly several Indigenous leaders, including one of our mutual friends, Jan Hania. And it was so incredible to finally get to spend time with him in person and hear about the amazing work they've been doing in New Zealand, getting rights of nature for Taranaki Monga. And the conversation around rights of nature has been one of the richest parts for me of Bioneers. There's so much progress happening in that space. And this whole idea of bringing the earth back into owning herself has been really powerful for me.
Yeah, this is a theme I'm particularly passionate about as well. I'm curious what else you're seeing in that space that gets you excited.
Yeah, well, there's a lot happening around rights of nature also in Central America and Latin America. And I know with Taranaki Monga, it's been kind of innovative for them to think about how the mountain could potentially own assets. And that's really relevant in my field of work. I work in nature finance, as you said, so I'm constantly thinking about how we put finance in service to life. And finance for too long has been governed by what's best for the shareholders, maximizing profit for the shareholders. And that's led, in my view, to this economy based on essentially sucking up the earth and turning it into money. Very extractive and destructive. And if we're able to put an ecosystem like Taranaki Monga on the board of a company, that really flips the ownership structure on its head and the objectives of the company. And the limited liability corporation, as we've seen, has been a really powerful technology or story, and it's really transformed the earth and really profound ways. And, what if we start to think about how that entity can be in service to life? And I've been having some interesting conversations with the Earth Law Center around this. They're working on a draft piece of legislation for an eco-centric corporation. So I've been talking to them about perhaps working with them on that. And I know there are some countries that are interested in adopting this legislation. So anyone could set up a company that its sole purpose would be in service to a particular ecosystem.
Yeah, the power of these legal and financial primitives and tools, I don't think can be understated. Like they drive so much of the ultimate human coordination behavior and how we relate to nature in our systems. And it seems like you've been doing this work for a long time. Maybe you can help us understand your journey and the arc of your experiences.
Sure. Yeah, I'm trained as an economist. Both my undergrad and graduate studies were in economics, very kind of traditional neoclassical economics. So I've had to do a lot of unlearning as well as learning to become an ecological economist, which is what I consider myself to practice now. And I have had to teach myself a lot of ecology, and I see economics as applied ecology at the end of the day. Our economy is within a closed loop system that is the Earth. And so it's ultimately, in service to the biosphere. It must be. And after college, I moved to Southeast Asia for a few years and was working on political economy stuff, analyzing kind of political and economic developments across Southeast Asia, and was doing a lot of hiking in the rainforest in Indonesia and Malaysia, and really falling in love with the life of the place. It was the first time I had really spent time in the jungle. And then I lived through one of the worst burning years in Indonesia in 2013. And every day I'd walk out of my apartment in Singapore to go to work, and I was breathing in a dying rainforest. And it really shook me. It was so painful to witness that, and seeing the footage on the news of the orangutans losing their habitat. And there were just massive fires. The smog in Singapore lasted for weeks. Wow. And so many people were just kind of shrugging their shoulders and putting on a mask and going about their day and saying, oh, this happens a lot. Like there's nothing we can do about it. Corruption or, land tenure, just pointing a lot of pointing their fingers at, whatever other entity, they thought could or should be solving the problem. And there were very few people in power at that time, I felt, that were really taking responsibility. And I couldn't swallow it. I couldn't deal with it. And so I decided at the time, I thought I might be a diplomat or I might work for a multinational corporation. And instead, I decided I wanted to focus on policy. And I saw policy as being this really impactful lever for changing how we take care of the biosphere. And so decided to go to graduate school, and that took me to DC, where I studied international relations and international economics and started focusing at this intersection of economics and finance and the earth. That was, pretty focused on climate at times, but I also always had an interest in ending deforestation and protecting old growth forest in particular. And so after graduate school, ended up at the World Bank. Donald Trump was elected my final year of graduate school. So my plan to go back to the US Treasury Department, where I had interned, kind of evaporated there. The US government wasn't so concerned about protecting the environment. at that time. So I ended up at the World Bank and working with governments around the world to think about how ecological criteria could be integrated into financial markets and financial decision making and how money flows. And so for probably about 7 years now, maybe a little bit longer, I've been in this inquiry, Matthew, of how do we change where money flows throughout society? And if we do that, can we change power? Can we change our relationship to the earth and how we interact with the earth through the economy? And during my time at the World Bank, and I'm kind of wrapping that up right now, but I've been there for 5.5 years, I really wanted to study the way economies are structured and the way financial systems are structured, both at the global level and at the national level, and really looking into what the levers of power are for changing how resources, how finance, the lifeblood of our economy flows, and what it flows to, and asking this question of how do we direct it to be in service of life?
Amazing. I mean, a lot of the environmental activists, conservationists I know, wouldn't necessarily think to go to the World Bank, right? Like so much of this movement is
quite a place.
Yeah, and I'm sure a lot of us would perceive the World Bank as like this mysterious, shadowy, organization that may have tons of control and may just be this bureaucratic administrative mess. And like it's a little bit opaque, I guess, if you're not in that world to really know. So maybe can you help like just describe the texture and the context of like what is the World Bank really like, or what is it like to work at the World Bank?
Sure. Yeah, it's definitely a multifaceted institution. There are so many amazing people working there that share our values and hope for change and really like transformation of our economic system. And it is a really bureaucratic institution. You're absolutely right about that. And all institutions are self-sustaining, right? This is kind of a principle of physics. We create a life form and it self-sustains. It does what it needs to do to keep itself alive. And so because of that, there are certainly limits to change within the institution. And I saw myself as what Joanna Macy often refers to as a Shambhala warrior. So someone kind of bringing peace and mindfulness and awareness to the halls of power, to institutions where maybe those things aren't as alive. And so really wanted to be driving change from the inside while I was learning a lot about how money flows, how power flows, and how economies are structured. And yeah, I did have influence while I was there. I feel confident about that. It was one of my goals to change the way the people I was speaking to, and many of them were in ministries of finance, were thinking about the ecological crisis. And I was working with this amazing group called the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Action, which is this group of 80 finance ministries from around the world that have committed to aligning their economies with the goals of the Paris Agreement. And these finance ministries were looking at climate in a narrow sense, right? Like through the lens of carbon emissions and climate impacts and adaptation to climate change. And I wanted them to expand their view to see the ecological crisis more broadly and to look at the role of the loss of nature, the loss of the biosphere, as also a really important risk for ministries of finance, that they could use their levers of power, their economic and financial policy tools to address. And I brought in various speakers. I brought in Elizabeth Marema, who is the executive secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity, and a really cool woman named Emily Mackenzie, who had worked on the Dasgupta Review, which was this big report the UK put out in 2020 on the economics of biodiversity. And I brought in these speakers to kind of seed ideas about, maybe we should be looking beyond climate in a narrow sense to look at the whole ecological crisis. And they eventually asked me to write a paper looking at nature-related risks and how those would transmit through the economy to ministries of finance and how they would affect the mandates of ministries of finance. And then also, what are the policy actions ministries of finance can take to start to bend the curve of nature loss? And really recognizing that these risks were not external to ministries of finance, but they are endogenous to the way the economy is structured.
Right.
So if you use your policy tools to structure the economy in a different way, you can mitigate these risks, right? You can create an economy that is truly in service to life. And so I published that paper last year, and it's influenced policy in several ministries of finance already. Finland, I'll give a shout out to Finland, published their integrated climate and nature strategy for their Ministry of Finance in December, right around COP15, the conference of the parties under the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, at which we got this new global biodiversity framework. Finance itself was really central to the negotiations and ultimately to the framework itself. It calls for all financial flows aligning with the overall goals of the framework. And I was advising the Convention on Biological Diversity for several years leading up to the negotiations about how important it was that finance was at the table and was part of that framework and negotiation. And the last agreement that came out of the Convention on Biological Diversity, the CBD, finance was not as engaged and it was not written into the text as explicitly as it was in this most recent agreement we got in Montreal in December. And so we didn't meet hardly any of the goals of that last agreement. So like bringing together the ecologists and the amazing nature protectors that are defending the biosphere and listening deeply to the biosphere, and all these, somewhat, rigid economists and people from the world of finance, investors, all the suits, bringing them together to have a conversation about how do we mitigate the risks that financial institutions, finance ministries, central banks are seeing more and more are accruing as we deplete the biosphere and also cause climate change. And of course, these are really interconnected and self-reinforcing. And the people that are doing the deep listening to how do we regenerate life on Earth? How do we come back into right relation with the Earth and be better protectors, and bringing them together to have a conversation about how we meet our goals and use our tools in an integrated way has been kind of the crux of my work for the past few years. And it's been a really exciting time to be working on this.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And congratulations on how those ripples are making their way through the system. I'm curious, like in practice, how much does Paris Agreement and this recent COP15 agreement around biodiversity, like, does it really matter a lot and people just don't even like grok the full importance of it? Or is it kind of like, yeah, it's a loose agreement, but it's non-binding amongst nation states and kind of puts up some ideas and goals, but no one's really following them? And like, help me understand from your lens, like how important do you feel these agreements really are?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I definitely have a personal inquiry around this as well. How much can we drive change from the top down, from places like the World Bank or the United Nations? And how much does it really have to be bottom up, people living in relationship to the land, taking back power, realizing their own power, and driving change from the grassroots. And where I'm at right now, and my theory of change is evolving all the time. So I'm super open, and this could change in the coming years for me. But I think it's both. I think it's absolutely both. And you're doing really important work telling stories, right? That's what we're doing here right now, is exploring stories and what new stories we can tell together. And I think the Paris Agreement and the Kunming-Montreal Agreement, which we got in December, are really important, inspiring stories about, in the case of the Kunming-Montreal Agreement, 198 countries coming together to agree on protecting the biosphere and bringing the economy back to be in service of the biosphere. And if you read the text, and I recommend many of your listeners do, it's not a incredibly wordy text. Like you can get through it, and there's a lot of beautiful stuff in there, including that Indigenous groups brought to the table about the need to take Mother Earth-centric actions, and the rights of nature is mentioned in there, and Indigenous peoples are mentioned, I think, 18 times. And there's a lot of beauty woven through that agreement. And to have that many countries come together and endorse that agreement, it's an incredible achievement. And I attended, both the conference part of the Conference of the Parties, which is, more about civil society and finance and business coming together to talk about implementation. But then I would also go sit in on the negotiations. And that was my first time at a UN COP. And so really like hearing the negotiations and the compromise that ultimately had to come out of these very long into the night negotiations that were ongoing, I found to be really beautiful in the way these negotiators were working together to try to create an agreement that works for everyone. It was really inspiring for me. So I think the UN processes certainly still have a lot to offer. And Indigenous peoples were there, and their power and rights were recognized unlike ever before. There's certainly still a very long way to go. But it was really cool to hear from so many Indigenous leaders that were in Montreal speaking about how important it was to get an ambitious global biodiversity framework and how that mattered for their tribe, and how important it was that they start to get resources to support the amazing guardianship that they're providing right now with very little access to resources that we are all benefiting from with every breath we take, every sip of water we drink, and every bite of food we eat. There is carbon being sequestered in forests, and the water cycle is being influenced by the guardians in the Amazon where you just were. And we are not paying them for those services that they're providing. And so that's a big part of my inquiry right now. How can we shift global systems to be in service to those people that are really, the grassroots of the grassroots, living very quiet lives in very remote villages, but doing work that affects us all. And just to bring it back, ultimately, I think it has to be top down and bottom up.
Yeah, well said. I really resonate with where you're at with that. Like, I think when Paris happened, I felt very skeptical. Like I felt somewhat angry, because I think that the buildup at that point, for many of us, felt like it didn't go far enough. And I think just being a little bit jaded by our institutions and like
Yeah.
the real ability for this kind of seemingly somewhat toothless agreement to really make a difference, and how narrow it was focused on carbon. But over time, my view on that has really softened because I've seen how much, even at the local level, whether it's in New Zealand or the United States, where most of my work has happened, whether it's councils or NGOs and, foundations and so forth, like we do seem to get our collective cues from some basic sets of principles and ideas and agreements, and the power that is implied by everyone in the world from a nation state perspective coming together, most nations coming together and actually agreeing on anything is just pretty rare.
Yep.
Right? The only other, to my mind, really examples of it tend to be like still divided in really heated geopolitical war, contexts. And so, the fact that we can actually have a collective conversation about climate, agree on some basic things, and even though 2050 is really far away and all of this, like it does seem to have trickled down in ways that created a bit more momentum. And it's not to say we can do this without really strong grassroots, local, bioregional action, but I guess I feel less jaded by so when the biodiversity agreement just hit, I'm kind of like, oh, okay, maybe this is like a really good sign that we're going to bring more of a biodiversity consciousness and hopefully more of a water consciousness to the forefront of our thinking. Before we get into kind of, some of that more local context, I would love to hear, what are some of the other trends or areas that you've noticed World Bank is looking at? I know you wrote a few blog posts when you were at the World Bank, and you've covered things like natural asset companies and like what are some of these different financial tools and ideas that the institutions and halls of power are really focused on?
Yeah, that's a good question. I just want to reflect quickly on what you just said about
Please.
The role of the Paris Agreement and the Kunming-Montreal Agreement. And I think for me, it reminds us all that we are first and foremost citizens of this amazing spaceship Earth, as Buckminster Fuller, one of my most kind of influential guides from the other side right now, says. And there are certainly parts of this little blue marble that we have to govern together. The atmosphere being one of them, the oceans being another one that I know you're also super passionate about. No country has jurisdiction over the oceans, so we have to work together on governing them. And I think there's an important role for localizing governance and resource dissemination, and I know we'll talk about all of that. But before we identify as citizens of our countries or our state or even our bioregion or city or town, we identify as citizens of the earth, I think there's a real perspective shift that can take place. So my work on financial instruments at the World Bank was really like asking the question, how do we create revenue that can serve investment in regenerating life on Earth under, some version of our current capitalist system, but recognizing sources of value where we hadn't before. And so a lot of that was looking at payments for ecosystem services markets like the global carbon market. Many countries that the World Bank works with also have water markets that might be regional or national. There are these biodiversity credit markets that are also emerging at the national level, but also at the global level. So looking at the way these emerging values for ecosystems can serve investment in conservation and regeneration. But with natural asset companies, we were looking at, okay, beyond selling sustainably or regeneratively produced products from the land, produce or timber or medicinal products, and taking the value of ecosystem services that can be traded on markets. Is there a way to monetize the intrinsic value of nature? Are people willing to invest in nature just because it exists, just because it has a value to us in its existence? And so I wrote a blog that maybe you've seen, that was looking at how institutional investors, big pension funds and insurance companies and sovereign wealth funds, these, largest in the world pools of capital. One of the entities we were working with was the GPIF, which is the Japanese pension fund, which is like the single largest pool of capital in the world. I think it's like $2 trillion or close to it. It's massive. They are exposed to the entire global economy, right? So their investments span everything. So there's no way for them to diversify away from the risks that the ecological crisis will cause to the economy. And so we were making an argument in this particular blog that these types of universal owners have an incentive to invest in protecting the most biodiverse places in the world. Because if we protect those places, it's essentially fertilizer for the rest of the investments of these institutions, because those places provide ecosystem services, provide stability in Earth systems that the entire global economy depends on. And if we lose them, there are going to be catastrophic impacts to the economy that will cause the value of these investments that pension funds and insurance companies and other financial institutions are making to fall. So that's an argument I've made in some of my writing, that financial institutions should look at not just risk associated with individual investments, but really look at systemic risk. And these universal owners are best positioned, I think, have the strongest imperative for starting to use their capital to address systemic risks.
On that point, when you speak to institutions of power, I'm really curious, because there's one argument which is what I crudely hear you, to crudely summarize what I hear you saying is kind of like, your portfolio is at risk because without this ecological wealth and these systemic risks, then all of your other investments are going to go down. You're speaking in the terms of money to the halls of power that are looking through it from the lens of money. And then there's also the argument of this is like life on Earth that sustains us all. Yeah. These are living beings and creatures. And your journey was somewhat catalyzed by breathing in a dying rainforest that was on fire, right? Absolutely. And how much do you, I know it's not an either or, but what do you find is the most effective way, or how do you determine the context in which you kind of go between these different ways of communicating and trying to influence whether it's policies or these financial instruments?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, Matthew. And this is a very live part of my own journey. And about 8 months ago, I moved out here to Oakland, California, the East Bay, where we are right now. And part of that was driven by needing to be more in relationship with nature, to be near the ocean and the tallest trees on earth, the redwoods, and to think bigger, because they were bigger and it just feels a lot more expansive out here. And to let this recognition of the sacredness of all life on earth drive my work more. And not having to see the value of nature through the lens of financial value or economic value. That was feeling constraining and narrow and not aligned with my spiritual path and how I was listening to nature through that work. And I'm really right now trying to bring my work, my professional work and my spiritual work more into harmony. And yeah, that's a live process. But certainly there are huge limits to just making the argument for what needs to be done through a financial or economic lens. And it's not going to get us all of the way there. It's not super profitable to regenerate life on Earth, nor should it be. And so while I think finance and economic policy is still a really impactful lever, and environment ministries in many ways have been sidelined and they've not had the same power that finance ministries have had. And they've been saying things that finance ministries are now saying for decades. And they've been under-resourced, or their policies that they thought were important have been undermined by more powerful economic interests in many countries, including this one. And so I saw when I was a graduate student, and still, see it this way mostly, that finance has so much power. And so it was a good entry point to create fast change. If we could get the attention of people that hold capital, and in our capitalist system, that means they hold a lot of power, to see the value of nature for their own mandate, we could create change quickly. And there's a lot of awareness and intention now in financial institutions and ministries of finance, central banks. There's a lot of modeling, there's a lot of focus on identification of metrics, and we should talk about that because I've done a lot of thinking around metrics in the past few years. But finance is still not flowing after, me doing this work for 7-8 years. At the rate that it's needed, and it's not flowing to the people and places where it's needed. And so I've grown quite frustrated with that, and in my more recent work have been thinking about how we bring together what we value in the economy and our values. And that for me has really shifted my work to the more local level, because so much of what we value and how we identify our values is local. It's in a cultural container. It's done in the relationship between people in their community and people and the land and waters that they care for. And so I have a lot of interest in, okay, how can we generate more value that supports people to live sustainable or regenerative livelihoods in the place where they are, that doesn't depend on big financial institutions in New York and London understanding what really is valuable in that community. And I know you have done a lot of work in the Web3 space, and this has brought me into an inquiry around how Web3 technologies can be in service to this value recognition and decentralization of financial resources, but also governance and decision making, and really remind us that power is with the people. And I've been asking how Web3 can be in service to people living in connection with place, taking back their own power and generating value locally.
Yeah, so can you share more, how could this look, and what are some of the visions and ideas that you've been exploring?
Yeah. So as I was explaining earlier, there are many financial institutions right now who are making commitments to invest in regeneration and conservation, and they're setting up funds. And I've worked with many of them, including now, working with a company that's building a fund, and we're actively developing an investment strategy to invest in nature conservation and regeneration. And oftentimes you go to conferences focused on investing in natural capital and this sort of thing, and you will hear over and over again investors saying, there's no pipeline of projects. There's no projects to invest in. We can't find investable projects. And since I've moved out to California, I've had many more conversations with people that have, quote, projects, right? People that are running nonprofits, or out here in California, there's some really cool ecosystem restoration camps that are doing massive fire restoration or fire risk mitigation work. Indigenous tribes that are doing incredible fisheries restoration work, dam removal, just like the most inspiring projects you can ever think of. And they are calling me because, they hear that I'm a nature finance specialist, and they're saying, I need just a little bit of money to support my thing, to create a regenerative business, to make investments in permaculture education that the community here is really depending on, to do this thinning and controlled burns to protect the structures and the community around me, that, ultimately it's like such a good investment to invest in any of these activities. And these people are struggling to get the tiniest bit of resources. And if they are getting resources, they're like bogged down in these super intense grant application processes. And if they get the grant, then like there are these really heavy reporting processes where they're having to report on all these metrics, and they're spending their time not doing the tending to the lands or the waters that they're caring for, which is what we all need them to do. They're spending their time filling out paperwork. And so I've been really frustrated by this kind of gap, as I see it, between the resources, which are super concentrated because of capitalism, right? That's the nature of capitalism. The concentration of resources and power is just becoming worse and worse all the time. Inequality is so high right now. And the regenerators, as I call them, this kind of mycelial web of regenerators that are living in deep relationship, often spanning decades, generations, even millennia, with the earth, with the waters. And they're taking care of that place and all of the more than human life that lives there, and the people in their communities that are dependent on this place, and they're not getting access to resources. Indigenous peoples get like a tiny percentage of overall climate finance flows. It's less than 1%, I think far less than 1%. And they're protecting 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity. That's a statistic that just blows my mind every time. And so I've been thinking through how we can bring these resources down so that they can be more in service to those people that have really small projects. And a concept that I've been working on with a couple of my collaborators, including the Buckminster Fuller Institute, is bioregional funds. What if every bioregion in the world had a nonprofit entity that was set up, that was structured to be in service to that place? And the fund can then aggregate external resources in the form of grants from philanthropists, from federal and state governments, but also investment capital from investors, right? They can raise a debt or equity portfolio, and the Bioregional Fund can pool these resources and then work with the community in the bioregion and even how you define the bioregion can be a democratic process, right? It can be developed through a cultural container. Maybe it's a watershed in one place. Maybe it's the surrounding area around a mountain or a gulf in another place. It should have a cultural container. But how do you bring together the people living and working and sustaining themselves in that bioregion to decide on a shared vision for how to steward and regenerate that place, and how resources should be used to do that. So I see this kind of democratic, community-led, grassroots process happening to decide on a bioregional plan, much the way the Amazon Sacred Headwaters Initiative has developed a bioregional plan for the Amazon Sacred Headwaters. And then the Bioregional Fund can be in service to that plan and can disseminate resources to all of the different actors in the place that are taking actions contributing to regeneration. And some projects might be better suited for grants, others that have business models might be well suited to take investment capital. Some might need a blend, right? A grant early on to kind of get up and running, and then they're able to take investment capital. And the Bioregional Fund could manage all of this. And in my view, the Bioregional Fund should be accountable to the community, to the people living in the bioregion, but also to the ecosystems themselves, which brings us back to the rights of nature work that you and I are both so excited about, and the work that's being done in New Zealand around giving personhood to this mountain that could perhaps own assets. Can you put nature on the board of the Bioregional Fund so that it's governed not just to support the needs of the people living there, but people are elected to look at and really embody what does the more than human life in this place need from these resources, and how do we put these resources in service to that? And this decentralization of how capital is deployed through these, small entities that are governed and legally mandated to be in service to that place. How can they bring relationships back into how we disseminate resources? And this brings us around to the metrics discussion that you and I have talked a bit about. So many of the metrics that I was working on identifying, and still in many ways working on identifying for big and medium-sized financial institutions and governments are very reductionist metrics, where you're pulling one thing out and saying, let's focus on the carbon that this ecosystem is sequestering. Let's focus on, the biodiversity of insects flying through the air. Like, we kept trying to pull out one piece of a thing that has its value in its interconnection and the relationships between. And pulling out one thing and then directing all of your resources towards that thing is kind of what got us into this situation in the first place, right? Profit. So if we say, oh, it's carbon, it's all about carbon, and direct all of our resources to projects that are sequestering the maximum amount of carbon, there can be unintended consequences, as we've seen in New Zealand. I know there are some massive monoculture forests being planted, in many other places as well.
Just pine plantations. I always make a point not even to call them forests because they, anyway. Keep going.
It's a biological desert, right? There's trees growing, but there's no life there. So I see the decentralization of finance, perhaps through a bioregional fund concept being deployed, enabling us to bring relationships back into how we measure success of how those resources are being deployed. and getting us out a bit of these reductionist metrics that are focused on quantification and enable the entity that's disseminating the resources to look at qualitative metrics for success and for regeneration. And in my view, we're headed for a lot of instability over the next at least decade, but probably longer, resulting from how much we have destabilized the biosphere. And we need to build resilience. And resilience is woven from relationships, from people living in relationship to place, from relationships between those people and their fellow community members that can take care of each other when a disaster strikes or learn from each other as the climate is changing. And from, of course, the relationships between the web of more than human life. And so, yeah, that's the big part of my inquiry right now is like, how do we bring finance to be in service to that?
Wow. I'm so glad we're having this conversation because you and I are both thinking about a lot of the same things. And yeah, so I have like a million questions and also comments. And then I also want to get back to metrics and hear a bit more of how you're thinking about, how do we kind of put into metric form these qualitative ways of relating. But okay, so on the bioregional funds, this potentially new atomic unit for organizing capital, because we see large concentrated pools of capital over here not finding its way into projects where often what's needed for the regenerators is $10,000, $50,000, relatively small grants. And that matches my experiences 100%. In my niche of the world, we did, starting in 2012, a philanthropic spend down fund of $5 million. And we ended up distributing that to roughly 400 organizations. We didn't have a thesis when we went in that it would be grants of a specific size. But what we found were that there were so many of these kinds of grassroots projects or relatively modest checks of $5,000 to call it $50,000 that were really needed to catalyze high value activity. But of the organizations that we've seen that are probably ready for $2 million or $5 million or $10 million, they're completely not getting those funds. By and large, they're just not getting them. And have demonstrated track records of success. They have a really good grasp on the ecology and the bioregional needs. And then on the other side, when you talk to institutions with large pools of capital, they're not really seeing the opportunities. They're saying like, well, there's no real clear places to put meaningful capital work. We can't go around writing $10,000, $50,000 checks. Like that's not our thing to do, especially if there's some sort of return of capital required embedded in that. It's maybe easier for a philanthropy model. So I feel that there's a lack of capacity on the institutional side as well. There's a lack of capacity in terms of thinking about ecological needs at more catchment and bioregional types of levels of scale, and mapping these spaces and having teams that are really kind of skilled in these spaces and understanding this, just as much as there's a shortage of projects, so to speak. But there are no shortage of the smaller scale projects, to your point. So that leads us to, I think the same place in our thinking, which is we need these kinds of intermediary funding mechanisms and vehicles. And the way I've been thinking about it is also, where does Web3 coordination play in? Because you can have this bottoms up formation of the bioregional funds or DAOs, some sort of distributed coordination mechanisms. And when you're distributing resources, of course, the key questions are going to be like transparency, who gets the funds, who gets to decide who gets the funds, how do you do this globally? Like, how do you create protocols and patterns and Lego bricks and blocks with our decentralized finance tools so that that can happen. And there's been really good work happening, for example, within Gitcoin. And Gitcoin does matching rounds, and they've built a highly tuned, even though it's still early days, I think they've done, at the time of this recording, 15, 16 rounds. They've distributed over $40 million. And they create these matching pools that then are democratically determined how the funds go out to, by basically the number of donors is given a lot more emphasis than just pure matching dollar for dollar. They call it quadratic funding. And there are a bunch of other experiments actually that are happening. And then the other thing I want to say, just because it gets me so excited, is, what crypto does is it enables us to give an economic address to a body of nature. So where Jan Hania, my colleague from Biome Trust, is doing incredible work around Mount Taranaki Maunga, that enables this idea that the mountain can hold assets. Well, in the crypto world, rights of nature has brought legal legibility to a body of nature, whether it's a river or a mountain or a forest or whatnot. But we haven't really had this economic legibility before. And Austin Wade Smith from Regen Foundation speaks really articulately to this, and we have an interview with him. We'll put a link.
Awesome.
But you can have the mountain literally have its own crypto wallet address.
Wow.
Right? And then who gets to decide the governance and ownership of that, right? Well, similar to how already these bodies of nature have trusts with boards, well, those are considered multi-signature individuals with their own cryptographic addresses that have to all come together and decide. So you can have, for example, someone that shows up to the mountain is going to put their $5 into the system for taking a hike for an ecotourism revenue. You could have a portion of that fund, of those funds, automatically go to the economic wallet address of the mountain, right? And so through smart contracts, and we basically bring nature into the economy, in addition to being able to do things like you mentioned of, well, can that mountain sit on the board of trustees for this bioregional fund? So anyway, those are just like some of the things swirling around in my mind about all of this. So
exciting. Yeah.
The one thing that the way you describe it that I really want to get into is who decides, who are the folks that set up these funds, and how do we decide who distributes the funds? Like, I can see the flow of capital from the big institutions into the fund, but like, who's here managing that fund, and how do we do that democratically and distributed and at a replicable scale?
Yeah. And what role do Web3 technologies play in all that?
Maybe, wherever you want to go with it. Yeah.
Yeah. First, just a reflection on the role of Web3 technologies in this space. I'm not an expert, but have followed really closely the work of the Regen Network and the Regen Foundation, and love their approach. Love that any community that wants to can put on the platform their protocol for assessing ecosystem service uplift on their land, right? So it really embeds it in this like local cultural container. Of course, you have to go through the Regen Networks process for review to ensure that it's robust. But once you get through that process, it's on there, it's an approved protocol, and you can issue Regen tokens. And I think absolutely their platform and Web3 technologies more generally can be in service to this decentralization of power and localization of how we view value in the upheaval in the voluntary carbon market right now that we've seen around Vera and all the controversy with that. I think we've seen the limits of global protocols for assessing what is valuable, what is the way to mitigate climate change in this ecosystem is different than it is in another ecosystem, and it needs to have a cultural container. So I like that Regen Network enables local communities to put forth their own culturally relevant methodology for assessing uplift of biodiversity or ecological integrity wherever they are.
And yeah, just double the shout out to Regen Network and Foundation. We're going to do an interview with Gregory Landua as well. And so
Love
people
Gregory.
can go check those out. Yeah.
Excited to watch that one. So to the point of governance, I think governance of these bioregional funds is absolutely the most difficult part. And again, that's not my area of expertise, but I've been having a lot of interesting conversations recently around this since I've been kind of working on this concept. And what's clearest to me is that when we pilot them, and I intend to pilot them in a few different bioregions, hopefully like within the next year, we need to go to places where there is community organizing, where there's maybe a bioregional strategy already in place, where work is being done and the grassroots are connected, and there's trust between community leaders and the people that live in that community. And in my view, the trust should be run by someone from the bioregion, someone that knows what's happening there. Hopefully someone that has an understanding of economics and finance and ecology and is a bridge builder like myself, can see these systems in an integrated way. So yeah, that's how I see it being governed. And I think it has to be accountable to the community. So there has to be a consultative process ongoing to decide how the resources are disseminated, and a participatory process for determining even the metrics that are going to be measured as those resources are disseminated. And those metrics decided by the community should be the ones reported back to the capital holders, in my view. This whole top-down, we're going to tell you what matters and you're going to measure that thing, is really outdated. I think that, in your work, you've also been exploring this. How do we listen to the communities about what matters to them and then use that as our metric of success?
Yeah. One concern I have about the way that we are evolving in climate finance with the carbon markets is this notion of additionality has led us to a paradigm where, because we're so focused on how to measure additional carbon sequestration, we're only looking at projects where it might be an existing degraded landscape, and then rewarding and incentivizing people to go plant trees on that landscape as a simplistic way of framing it. And that proves additionality. Whereas if someone's sitting a guardian of a biodiverse, rich, natural old growth rainforest, it's like, well, sorry, we can't really give you carbon credits because we can't prove that any more carbon is being sequestered than otherwise would have, because it's already all there.
Yeah.
And that simplistic frame, if you think about it, it's like, well, who do we want to give resources to? The people who are doing the right actions already, who are experts at the stewardship of land already, who have expertise, or people who are just maybe taking a more industrialized approach to understanding, okay, great, well, I'm going to put in what I've seen in New Zealand, just rows and rows and rows of pine trees, monoculture, they're not the ecologists necessarily. And I think that same pattern could emerge in these kinds of bioregional funding mechanisms. And what we want are people who are really skilled at land stewardship and in tune with the environment to be absolutely at the decision-making table about where these resources go.
Yeah.
So the question is, how do we cultivate that from a bottoms-up perspective where we're drawing those experts out of the communities? Because they're not always in the institutional halls of power. They're not always skilled at finance either.
Right.
So we need bridge builders like you and possibly like me, but we also need the ecological specialists to be married into these conversations with then where we're getting the funds from, whether it's pension funds or, governments and philanthropy and so forth. And so that's where I feel like the go-to-market strategy, and this is my latest thinking on all of this, is to somewhat, start with these smaller grassroots projects that are emerging. So it's like, okay, great. Here's a tree nursery. Here's a permaculture experiment. Here's conservation of 10 acres. Here's, a water catchment cleanup. Here's all these projects. And if we can kind of create transparency and visibility into what's happening at a bioregional level, and we start to layer on things like reputation, we start to layer on track record, measurements, and this gets back to the metrics conversation and so forth, then we can start to effectively create an environment where those ecological leaders are recognized within a bioregion and more naturally take shape as kind of delegates of governance. And so I think that Web3 is actually giving us a lot of really neat patterns on this already, but it's tending to happen in kind of open source software space or decentralized finance purely, and hasn't yet fully taken shape here. And if we think about like Web2, we got Uber and Airbnb and sharing economy and like all of these great new patterns, but we never got it with kind of an environmental lens. We never got like the Uber for gardens or like, the Airbnb for land stewardship. So I think if we kind of bring that set of patterns into Web3 with these distributed governance and coordination mechanisms, I don't know, I just think it's super exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be clear, like, I think there is still a huge role for metrics that can be quantitative.
Right.
I think it's both and, right? It's like bringing together the masculine and the feminine. And economics and finance has been so focused on very masculine structures and approaches and metrics. And if you talk about things like well-being or resilience or relationships, people in finance are like, no, like we don't think about that. So I'm trying to like bring that back into some of these systems. But
how does it show up? Like, can you give me more of a felt sense of how you imagine this can work?
Yeah, well, I think the grassroots bottom-up democratic processes for deciding how resources could be disseminated in the bioregion allow those concepts to emerge, right? Rather than top-down coming from a big financial institution, which has a legal mandate that doesn't take into account how the resources ultimately affect the people at the bottom of that financial flow. So when the community comes together, they can agree on here's what matters to us here, and here's our shared vision. Here's where we want our bioregion to be in 20 to 30 years. And we all agree on this. And, health and well-being and these more qualitative things can be taken into account. That's how I see kind of the feminine coming into integration again with more masculine systems and structures like finance. But I am super excited about Earth observation technology and all that's happening in that space. Shout out to Martine Weinstein, who's doing some incredible work on this at Open Earth.
Open Earth. Also shout out to Planet Labs.
Yes.
Yeah, Robbie and Will and the whole team there really, giving this a serious look. And I feel like are coming at it with a strong ethical lens. And
Absolutely.
how the Earth observation satellite systems that are being constructed right now can really be in service to this field.
Absolutely. So through geospatial monitoring, as well as like hyperspectral satellites, which are satellites that can allow us to see all of the different colors in a forest canopy or even a grassland, and can show us the biodiversity of that place from, from space. That can tell us a lot about the health of an ecosystem. There's a lot of cool work happening in the area of eDNA, environmental DNA. My friends at Nature Metrics in the UK are doing a lot of work to bring down the cost of assessing environmental DNA. So that tells you about every living thing that's in that ecosystem. And then bioacoustics. My friends at the Crowther Lab are doing some super cool work around bioacoustics.
Oh, I really want to talk to them.
Yeah. Happy to connect you.
Yeah.
So this stack of geospatial, I guess bioacoustics would probably be next if we're going from macro to micro, and then eDNA measuring the tiniest things. That can tell us so much about the health of an ecosystem. And I do think we need this global dashboard for monitoring the health of Earth. And this can create more accountability on every layer and can be more integrated with Web3 technologies as well, right? If we can see how activities in a certain place are contributing, hopefully, to regeneration, but also where economic activity associated potentially with a particular farm or corporation is destroying the biosphere, how do we then create accountability to bring that actor back into right relation and have them do the repair work that's needed from the damage that they caused? And because there is no, large scale, transparent, easily accessible to the public way to monitor this activity right now, it's been hard to stop the bad stuff and support the good stuff. So I think Earth observation and having this kind of global dashboard to monitor the health of the Earth is really important. And then from there, you can incentivize and support all types of actions. And like the Bioregional Fund, I think would absolutely use that dashboard. But also, I have friends that are working on the gamification of regeneration actions. How do we create incentives through the gaming world to drive people to take actions, but also to go monitor other actions and create accountability that way? And one thing that I've been thinking about in terms of a perhaps Web3 application that could be in support of the bioregional funds is a bioregional currency. So I talked about how the bioregional fund could bring in external resources to the fund that are in service to that place, but also can the bioregional fund play a role in helping the community to recognize the value of actions supporting regeneration locally that are only valuable locally? And can you create a local currency that pays people for doing things, for transitioning from conventional farming to regenerative farming, or fire resilience work that I was talking about in California, and it's accepted by local businesses. So I've been in an inquiry around this recently and have been talking to some people working in the local currency space.
Yeah, because when my cursory understanding of previous local currency projects and experiments, mostly in the United States and some in Europe, where they've fallen short is the inability to get out of their local context and then create tradability into. So if you want to leave your local community and town and you have your 100 tokens of that local context, how do I get that back into US dollars or euros or whatever? And that the lack of liquidity somewhat imposes size constraints on the scalability of these, because there's been a lot of local currency experiments over the last decades and centuries, and even with governments making it very difficult. And yet again, I think crypto really brings a whole new level here, because we can create permissionless 24/7 global trading pairs on what are called automated market makers like Uniswap, which has already had well over $1 trillion traded on it. I mean, this is not like some crazy idea. This is a battle-tested protocol that's working. And so you can actually create liquidity pools so that you ensure that there's incentive mechanisms for people to put liquidity so that that local currency can then get traded into other more larger liquid currencies. And so now all of a sudden we have open source tooling that's permissionless, decentralized, censorship resistant, already exists, mechanisms to stitch together the mycelial connections between local currency projects, which is like mind-blowing.
Totally.
And I don't hear yet a lot of local and bioregional currency experiments in crypto. I think that the Cosmos ecosystem...
Let's start one, Matthew.
Yeah. Well, we've already gone through like 5 things that we're going to start on this episode. There has been some good thinking, especially in the Cosmos ecosystem, about bioregional and local currencies from, I know some of the founders and folks involved in that have pointed to, and I'm sure there's more happening across Ethereum as well. But yeah, I think it's still a nascent conversation.
Yeah, but I think what my realization around this has been is that what is really valuable, particularly, in this like period of instability that I was mentioning earlier, is not necessarily tradable on global markets. And so to the extent that we can leverage Web3 technologies to support local communities to decide what is valuable to them locally, we can really support regeneration that community will benefit from, and the whole world ultimately will benefit from.
Yeah, and this gets to kind of, I guess, my big final, unfair question. I know that I've grappled with it so much. I'm sure you have as well. Like all of these things somewhat take a paradigm of reducing down into financial terms that which can't be reduced, right?
Yeah.
And, we live in a capitalist system that seems to have a lot of the ails created by that reductionism. And so how do we reconcile as climate, nature, finance geeks, this paradox where, the answer to, the current system can't just be more reductionism and slice things into more finer bits, even though we're trying to recognize value that's currently not being recognized within the context, and we're trying to use the tools of the existing economy to support life. How do you think about all of this? And any tips for me? Because this is what really I feel like I don't want to commodify nature more by going into these realms, and yet like I don't know any other way.
Yeah, this is a big one, and I've probably got more questions about it than answers, but I'll tell you how I'm thinking about it. So I see carbon markets and biodiversity credit markets and all of these ecosystem service markets as transition finance. I believe, and it's been my experience, that the earth is sacred and all of the ecosystems on her surface are the organs of her body, of our body. And every day that we are losing them, and I've felt this since I breathed in that dying rainforest a decade ago now, where we're losing intelligence that took billions of years to evolve.
Right.
And we have to urgently stop the bleeding, stop the loss of old growth forest and mangroves and all the other really biodiverse ecosystems that are holding so much intelligence. And capitalism is not going away tomorrow, as much as I wish it was. And we were birthing into being a new, more ecologically and spiritually inclined way of disseminating resources. But it's changing, it's transforming. And I think ecosystem services markets can provide a pretty quickly deployable source of capital that if we create the right structures and metrics for how that money flows, it can support conservation of these super biodiverse places. And as I was saying earlier, I think that the moment is really right in terms of the awareness that's been built in financial institutions and institutions like the World Bank, the IMF. I'm headed to the World Bank and IMF spring meetings on Tuesday, so I'm sure there'll be a lot of interesting discussions around nature happening there. There's awareness around the need to act quite urgently. And so can we leverage existing financial tools and instruments and structures and these, quickly emerging payments for ecosystem services markets to support those ecosystems as we transition to an economy that sees all life on Earth as sacred. And, there's no question about, whether we should destroy life to power our lives, transport ourselves, clothe ourselves, feed ourselves. Like, we have just completely changed how we do all of those things so that it's regenerating life on Earth rather than extracting and destroying it. So there's a transition element, but this is, something that I'm always thinking about in my own work. How much of my energy do I put into supporting kind of the quick wins that aren't transformational and the big, dreamy, transformational stuff? And what I have found is that I need a bit of both. That's, as a bridge builder, that's the space that I occupy. I want us to move quickly here where we can within the bounds of existing systems and leveraging, increasing awareness that is being developed, and also really work on developing new stories that can be transformative. And capitalism is a story, money is a story, corporations are stories. Can we tell new stories about how we interact with the Earth through the economy? And I think we can, and I think you are. That's what you're doing here today.
Well, that's what we did today. I really appreciate your time. This conversation went so well from my vantage point. I think we're both enlivened by a lot of the same things and ideas right now. So
totally
quite a pleasure to connect with you at Bioneers. I'm glad to be on the journey. Thank you for all the work you do. Is there anything else you want to leave us with? Any other questions I didn't ask or final messages you want to share?
My final message would be that everyone working in this space in any shape or form, the Web3 space, finance, ecology, can benefit from spending more time in the forest, in the ocean, just listening, just being quiet and listening to Indigenous tribes. And that's been a big part of my work over the past couple of years, is doing a lot more listening. And it's dramatically transformed the way I see all of these things.
Beautiful. Samantha Power, thank you so much.
Thank you, Matthew. Nice talking with you.
All right, what do you think? Leave us a comment below. I appreciate how Samantha recognizes the leadership of Indigenous peoples in the climate movement. And I'm also excited that she's focused on this bioregional scale funding. Can't wait to see what she cooks up next in this arena. You can follow Samantha's work at financeforgaia.com. There's a link in the show notes. You can find more conversations like this one at our website, maearth.com. That's maearth.com. And you can find me in the community Discord. So especially if you're interested in these topics around regenerative finance, rights of nature, bioregional scale funding, I'd love to connect with you. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.